Right now, somewhere within 100 meters of you, there is probably a pigeon on a windowsill, on a power line, pecking at a dropped fry outside a fast food joint, standing on a statue's head like it pays rent there. Pigeons are among the most widespread birds living alongside humans, and in some cities, they seem almost impossible to escape. Unlike most wild birds, pigeons have become remarkably comfortable around people. They'll walk right up to a park bench, hop onto a food cart, or nest directly above a busy street without a second thought. So here's a question that sounds ridiculous until you actually sit with it for 5 seconds. If there's an animal this abundant, this easy to find, and, as you're about to find out, genuinely delicious, why isn't it on a single menu at your local restaurant? We eat chickens by the tens of billions every year. We farm cows, pigs, ducks, but the one bird that has fully conquered human civilization, that lives in our parks and nests on our rooftops, we call it a pest. Cities have spent decades trying to control their populations, and yet, quietly, in 5-star restaurants in Paris, in centuries-old dishes across Egypt, in Cantonese kitchens in Hong Kong, people are eating pigeon. Chefs call it a delicacy. So, what's actually going on? Why does the same species get treated as a luxury dish on one side of the world and as flying garbage on the other? By the end of this video, you'll understand the full story, and you might look at the bird on your windowsill a little differently. Before we answer, why don't we eat them, we need to clear up a misunderstanding, because most people don't actually know what a city pigeon is. The gray bird on the sidewalk with the shiny green-purple neck is a feral rock dove, and here's the twist. It isn't some wild species that wandered into our cities on its own. It's a feral rock dove descended from birds that humans domesticated and selectively bred. Going back thousands of years, rock doves were originally cliff-dwelling birds native to Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, nesting on rocky ledges. Thousands of years ago, people in the ancient Near East began encouraging rock doves to live around human settlements, eventually developing purpose-built dovecotes to keep and harvest them. Much of the bird's food came from foraging in nearby fields, which made them unusually cheap to maintain, compared with larger livestock that needed pasture and daily feeding. Ancient Egyptians built dovecotes along the Nile. Romans wrote detailed guides on pigeon husbandry. Medieval European lords built elaborate stone dovecotes on their estates, some of which still stand today. Circular towers lined with hundreds of individual nesting holes, designed so estate workers could reach in and collect eggs and squabs without disturbing the rest of the colony. In parts of medieval Europe, the right to maintain a dovecote was even associated with land ownership and social status. Pigeon meat, especially young pigeon, called squab, was prized enough to sometimes be reserved for nobility. Pigeon offered something larger livestock could not, a relatively small animal that could be raised without the pasture required by cattle or sheep. So here's the twist nobody tells you. Part of the modern city pigeon story begins with the fact that we once domesticated and farmed these birds. Many of the pigeons living in cities today descend from domesticated rock doves and their feral populations. Tall buildings with ledges accidentally resemble cliffsides, and human food waste gave them an endless supply of calories. In other words, the pest outside your window used to be somebody's dinner and possibly somebody's livelihood, a small farm asset that fed a household without needing pasture, feed grain, or daily labor. So what changed between then and now? Let's kill the first myth. People absolutely still eat pigeon, and in serious culinary circles, it's treated as an elite ingredient, not a joke. Squab is a young farm-raised pigeon, usually harvested around 4 weeks old before it's ever flown. Because the flight muscles are undeveloped, the meat stays tender and rich, closer to duck than to regular chicken, with a deeper, almost liver-like flavor. In France, pigeon has old aristocratic roots. Dovecotes were historically a symbol of land ownership, and squab dishes were considered refined enough for formal dinners, often paired with rich reductions or foie gras. In Hong Kong and Cantonese cuisine, roasted whole pigeon is a celebration dish, marinated and fried until the skin turns deep mahogany and shatters, the kind a host orders specifically to impress guests. In Egypt, stuffed pigeon, hammam mashi, filled with spiced rice or frika, isn't a fine dining novelty at all. It's traditional home cooking, tied directly to that same Nile Valley farming history, with mud brick dovecotes still visible in some rural villages today. In Morocco, pastilla was traditionally made with shredded pigeon under a sweet, spiced pastry shell, though modern versions often swap in chicken simply because pigeon is harder to source in bulk now. And in the UK and parts of Europe, wood pigeon, a wild, field-feeding relative of the city bird, is also eaten as wild game and is valued for its distinctive, lean meat. meat, so the meat was never really the obstacle. Chefs and nutrition writers describe squab as flavorful, comparatively lean, and high in iron and protein. The meat itself is a perfectly established food source when the birds are raised and handled for consumption, which means the real question isn't about the meat itself, it's about which pigeon we're actually talking about. Commercial squab comes from birds raised specifically for food, under controlled diets and husbandry conditions, rather than the unpredictable environment of a city street. Kept in pair-bonded breeding aviaries and harvested young, the pigeon on your sidewalk is a very different situation, even though it's the same species. That bird has spent its life eating whatever it can find, including scraps from dumpsters and street trash, living in close, crowded roosts under bridges and building eaves. And crowded roosts can increase opportunities for parasites and infectious organisms to circulate between birds and picking through city dust and grit, which can expose them to contaminants such as lead, detected at elevated levels in some urban pigeon populations. But it's important to be precise here, because this is where a lot of the online conversation gets it wrong. An urban pigeon is not automatically poisonous or diseased just by existing. The real problem is that a random city pigeon comes with an unknown diet, an unknown environment, unknown exposure to pathogens and pollutants, and no inspection or controlled handling behind it. The same reason you wouldn't casually eat a random stray chicken you found wandering through a landfill either. The risk isn't written into the species, it's written into the specific unmonitored life that particular bird has been living. Two specific health concerns come up a lot in this conversation: histoplasmosis and cryptococcosis, and it's worth being accurate about them because they get misquoted constantly. Both are fungal illnesses tied mainly to inhaling dust from long accumulated droppings in enclosed spaces like attics, barns, or spots under bridges where large numbers of birds roost over months or years. That's a real reason to be careful around dense roosting sites. It's not a reason to assume eating a properly cooked pigeon will make you sick. Those are two different exposure pathways entirely, and conflating them is exactly how a legitimate environmental health concern turns into an exaggerated food safety myth. There's also the bacterial side, things like salmonella, which can live in a bird's gut depending on what it's been eating. This is true of basically any animal, including chicken, which is exactly why commercial poultry farming has strict slaughter and inspection protocols in place. The difference with a random city pigeon is simply that none of that oversight exists. Nobody is checking that bird before it ends up anywhere near a plate. So the meat isn't automatically dangerous, and the species isn't automatically dirty. It's the specific, unmonitored conditions most city pigeons live in that make them a genuinely poor casual food choice, while farmed squab, the exact same species, raised differently, remains a clean, viable food eaten around the world. Pigeon keeping for meat was a widespread practice for centuries. It didn't vanish overnight. It gradually disappeared from much of the Western food system, and the reason has almost nothing to do with taste or safety. It's economics. In the late 19th and especially the 20th century, industrial poultry farming transformed chicken into a highly optimized mass production meat source. Modern broiler chickens can reach market weight in roughly 6 to 7 weeks, and the entire system, breeding, feeding, and processing, was built around high density, high turnover output. Pigeons are poorly suited to the scale and production efficiency that made industrial chickens so dominant. They reproduce differently. A breeding pair normally lays only 2 eggs per clutch, compared with a chicken laying almost daily, and pigeons depend on pair-bonded parents to raise their young rather than fitting into the dense, high-turnover breeding systems used for chickens. A squab still takes roughly 4 weeks to reach harvest weight, but the overall output per breeding pair can't scale the way chicken production can. You'd need vastly more breeding pairs, more housing, and more labor to match even a fraction of what a modern chicken operation produces from a single facility. Once chicken became dramatically cheaper and easier to produce at industrial scale, pigeon had little chance of becoming a comparable mass-market meat. It's worth remembering that chicken itself wasn't always cheap. Well into the 20th century, it was still considered something of a special occasion meat in parts of the world, before selective breeding and industrial scale brought the price down to where it is today. Pigeons simply never went through that same transformation, because nobody had the economic incentive to push it there once chicken had already won. The centuries-old dovecote tradition that used to dot the European and Middle Eastern countryside quietly faded from everyday use, surviving mainly in specific culinary traditions and smaller gourmet operations rather than as a mainstream protein source. By the time industrial poultry farming had taken over, pigeon simply wasn't built for that kind of scale, and that gap in production efficiency, more than any lack of appeal, is what left it off the mass market. Losing that economic race explains why pigeon farming shrank. It doesn't fully explain why we now actively dislike city pigeons. That part is cultural. As pigeon farming declined and cities grew, the feral descendants of those domesticated birds thrived in urban environments where buildings provided nesting sites and human food waste provided abundant calories. Populations grew and so did complaints, droppings on buildings, noise, and a general public sense that pigeons were dirty. Somewhere around the mid-20th century in New York, the famous rats with wings nickname started making the rounds. Its exact origin is debated, but it stuck hard, and it became the default mental image of the bird across much of the English-speaking world. That matters more than it sounds like, because once an animal gets branded that way, it becomes almost psychologically impossible to picture it as food, regardless of the actual biology. Nobody wants to order rat off a menu, even if what's on the plate is a clean, farm-raised bird. Food taboos in general are shaped far more by culture and history than by any consistent rule about what's biologically clean. Rabbits are pets to some and dinner to others. Horses are eaten across parts of Europe and considered unthinkable in the US and UK. Dogs are family members across most of the world and, in a handful of specific regions, historically food. None of these lines track cleanliness or nutrition in any consistent way. They track upbringing, history, and what a culture happened to normalize. Pigeons simply got unlucky. They went from farmed food animal to urban nuisance in the public imagination over the course of a few decades, and that rebrand never really got undone. So, 4 real overlapping reasons: a genuine safety gap between unmonitored city pigeons and controlled farm-raised squab, an economic story where pigeon farming lost out to the speed and scale of industrial chicken, a cultural rebrand that turned food animal into flying rat almost overnight in public perception, and the twist? It's simply not true that nobody eats pigeon. Squab remains a respected, sometimes expensive delicacy across French, Cantonese, Egyptian, and other culinary traditions, proving the meat itself was never the real obstacle, which points to something bigger than pigeons. Almost every food taboo feels obvious from the inside. If you grew up eating chicken and never eating dog, that line probably feels self-evident. But pigeons are a case study in just how much of that line is drawn by history, economics, and branding, rather than biology, because the same species sits on both sides of it at once, depending only on which country you're standing in and which specific bird you're looking at. A farm-raised squab and a feral pigeon in a city belong to the same species, but their environments, diets, and exposure to contaminants can be completely different. What separates delicacy from pest in most people's minds isn't the animal, it's diet, environment, and a nickname that stuck decades ago. And once you notice that with pigeons, it's hard not to start noticing it everywhere else in the food world too, in which insects different cultures treat as a great source of protein and which ones make other audiences recoil, in which fish are treated as luxury seafood in one country and used as bait or animal feed in another, in which cuts of meat get thrown away as waste in one tradition and served as the most prized dish at the table in another. None of this is about telling you what you personally should or shouldn't eat. That's a personal choice, shaped by everything from culture to allergies to plain preference, and that's completely fine. It's more just a reminder that a surprising amount of what feels like a hard, obvious fact about food is really a cultural story that could have gone a different way, and in plenty of places, it genuinely did. So next time you see a pigeon on the sidewalk, you're not looking at an animal that's naturally inedible. You're looking at feral livestock, living wild in a city, eating garbage instead of grain. The same species chefs in Paris and Hong Kong are plating up right now, just living a very different life. Kind of changes how you look at that bird on your windowsill, doesn't it? If you learned something, let me know in the comments. Drop the most surprising fact from this video below, whether it's the dovecote history, the flying livestock idea, or the fact that pigeon is quietly a fine dining staple in 3 different continents. And if you want the next video to dig into why humans eat some animals and not others around the world, the full weird psychology of food taboos, hit subscribe, because that one's coming next.